This was my precious book baby that I gave my life to for 7 years. I learned Yiddish. I read God knows how many lengthy socialist texts in various languages. I went to Ukraine during the Russian invasion and to Poland, to Latvia, to Lithuania. I buried myself in archives, including like family archives that no one else has access to. And I wrote this book that's a tribute to the Jewish Labor Bund and also a tribute to my great grandfather, Sam Rothbort.
Hello and welcome to Why Is This Happening with me, your host, Chris Hayes. You know, it's an interesting thing about the way history works and the way that ideological or religious or political movements work, that things that start at the margins or start with a small group of people and then achieve some sort of power or even dominance. You know, when you go back to the moments where it's in the margins, it seems preposterous, absurd that it would gain the power that it had. I mean, St. Paul, going around the Mediterranean, probably has no idea that this little religion that he's working on is going to be the dominant force in Western history for literally millennia. And that's true of when you study revolutionaries throughout the years. It's also true that like sometimes the inverse happens. Sometimes incredibly powerful, profound, meaningful ideological or political movements happen, and then they kind of go away and their history gets a little lost. And so sort of they kind of get written out. This is true of a whole bunch of different movements that happen in the US. It's particularly true of like a bunch of spiritual movements that happened in the US that were incredibly powerful at certain times in our history and then kind of dissipate and get lost. And in some ways, those are the stories, those are some of the most interesting and important stories for understanding how history actually develops. Because there's such a contingency to how these battles, ideological, political, military battles happen. But to go back and recover one of those histories, an ideological, political movement from the past that didn't win out, is to also recover some possible future, some possible path forward, that some path that wasn't taken. And I kept thinking about that as I was reading this incredible new book that is getting a lot of acclaim. It was very positively reviewed in the New York Times. It debuted at number 4 in the bestseller list. You may have seen it around because it is also so sort of ungodly timely. It's called Here Where We Live Is Our Country, The Story of the Jewish Bund. The Jewish Labor Bund was a democratic socialist Jewish organization. It's founded in the very end of the 19th century. It's actually founded the same year as the Zionist movement is founded, with an incredibly different vision of Jewish flourishing and Jewish safety. In fact, they're kind of enemies for the entire of their ideological lives, which we'll discuss. And it also is there at every hinge point of the bloody 20th century. It ends up fighting communism and sort of losing to Bolshevism. It fights fascism, and it fights Zionism. It's an ideology that is none of those, all three of which have left their marks on the world in power, in state, sometimes in blood. The Bund didn't do that. But what's recovered in this incredible history is an alternate vision, one who still has a kind of beauty to it and a profound sort of message for us today. And so I'm really excited to have the author of this great new book, Here We Live As Our Country, Molly Crabapple. She's an artist, she's a journalist, she's a writer. She's author of a number of books, incredible books she co-wrote about the Syrian war. And she is the New York Times bestselling author, we can now say, of Here Where We Live As Our Country, The Story of the Jewish Bund. Molly, it's great to have you on the program.
I'm so stoked to be here, Chris.
Congratulations. This is really an amazing accomplishment. I just want to like set up the fact that this is 7 years of work, archival research, learning Yiddish, research assistants in multiple languages to produce what is basically the kind of first history of this powerful, remarkable organization that sort of spanned the world that we've had in many years.
Thank you. Yeah, this was my precious book baby that I gave my life to for 7 years. I learned Yiddish. I read God knows how many lengthy socialist texts in various languages. I went to Ukraine during the Russian invasion and to Poland, to Latvia, to Lithuania. I buried myself in archives, including like family archives that no one else has access to. And I wrote this book that's a tribute to the Jewish Labor Bund and also a tribute to my great grandfather, Sam Rothbort.
who sounds like a truly remarkable person. He comes alive in the pages here. Tell us about your great-grandfather.
My great grandfather, Sam, was a post impressionist painter, and I grew up surrounded by him. My mother learned to paint from Sam, and I learned to paint from my mom. So I always viewed just the fact that I was an artist as this sort of multi generational gift from him. And I grew up in a house with his paintings, with his sculptures, with his handwritten affirmations to himself, stuff like reject spineless authority and without art, you're dead. I grew up hearing the stories about how he took back his own painting from the Brooklyn Museum because he didn't like where they hung it, and then made his own Rothbard Home Museum of Direct Art where he would like lay his paintings on his lawn, and he was convinced it was competing with the Met. And I also grew up with a very strong vision of the place that he came from, which was a small town that's now in Belarus called Volkovisk. And I had this vision of Volkovisk because he painted hundreds of what he called memory paintings, which were almost like these journalistic snapshots of every aspect of life, from like the most sacred to the most silly to the most profane.
The life world that he grows up in comes alive in the pages here, and one of the things that I love about this book is the recovery of life, of the texture of life in the Pale of Settlement, in the part of sort of Western Russian Empire, current day Ukraine, parts of Poland, parts of Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, that like is the sort of ancestral home of so many American Jews that I know and grown up with, right? So many people that have been close to me in my life and who have a sort of sense. I think because it was a traumatic place, it was as you
Extremely
paint,
traumatic.
like genuinely, truly awful. And you will get into like the sort of levels of kind of terror, violence, oppression, and penury and misery there. But it always is like feels like behind a curtain. You know, I think for American, particularly for American Ashkenazi Jews who came from that world, particularly that whose ancestors emigrated around this time that the Bund is getting started and there's like pogroms and stuff. It's sort of behind a dark curtain. You know what I mean? It's like
Yeah,
that. It's like the
absolutely.
over there, and I don't know. It was really bad, and we left. And
Yes.
what's sort of reclaimed here is the texture of it, and again the texture of the badness, but also the texture of sort of beauty and spiritual life and communal life and life. Tell us about that world of the Pale Settlement in this period when the Bund is started.
The Pale of Settlement is actually a legal construction in the Tsarist Empire. It's this slice of Western borderlands that originally the empire acquired when it partitioned Poland, that had probably the largest Jewish population in the world living there. And the Russian Empire was really, I'm going to say something shocking, it was quite anti Semitic. And they did not want Jews to be able to move to the capital city, St. Petersburg. They didn't want them to rise in Russian society. And so they segregated them in these borderlands and they made all of these laws about what you could do, how many of you could go to university, where you could travel, if you could live in the countryside or you had to live in towns. Just this whole legal body of stuff meant to suffocate you. But these borderlands were not just a place of misery. They were also the cradle of so many movements of Jewish civilization. Like, I think of Vilnius, Vilna, as it was called back in the day. It was called the Jerusalem of Lithuania because of the magnitude of the religious minds that were there. People who were developing whole, like, Jewish religious philosophies. And I think about, these great cities that were there that were literary cradles. Like, I remember when I went to Odessa the first time, I'd never been lucky enough to go to Ukraine before 2022, and I visited Kyiv, Odessa, and Lviv. And I remember thinking, like, wow, I never knew these places were so beautiful.
Mhm. So beautiful and so rich in sort of in culture and life, in literature, in spiritual learning. Obviously, the Jews. This was where most of the world Jewry was living at the time, through a set of complicated migrations, some of which they'd been invited into Poland, and then kind of, then the Polish king turned on them, which is a sort of recurring story, of course, in Jewish history. Talk about the founding of the Bund and what the people who found it are, what year it is, and what they're responding to in this Tsarist empire, which again, everyone kind of learns their history of the Russian Revolution, but like the depredations of the Tsarist Russia, really, I mean, again, I was like reacquainted reading your book of just like what an utterly god awful regime that was.
The Bund was created by these young Jewish Marxists who came to the realization that as young Jews, workers living in the Tsarist Empire, they essentially had three boots stamping on their face. First, they lived in the Tsarist Empire, which is run by this family of impossibly spoiled idiots who literally are wasting the country's money making little diamond eggs that opened up to other little diamond eggs. This is a family that is so inbred that the Tsar's son has blood that no longer clots.
Yes, it doesn't clot. Yes, I love that detail.
I mean, this is a country that will send you to Siberia for having a book club. So everyone in the Tsarist Empire is oppressed because they live under the Tsar, and that is bloody awful. In addition, if you're a worker in the Tsarist Empire, it's actually much worse than being a worker, let's say, in France or Germany, because there isn't the sort of gains that the labor unions had in those countries. And also, it's a lot poorer because you live under this idiotic autocracy. But you're also oppressed as a Jew. Jews in the Tsarist Empire are a racialized minority. It says you're Jewish on your passport. You have all these laws that are just meant to ruin your life. But the thing that also blights your life as a Jewish person is we know whenever a government targets a minority, that gives permission for all of these kind of freelance racists and bigots to do really violent stuff. It's not a coincidence that the word pogrom is a Russian word. And these young Jewish Marxists decided that they needed a Jewish organization that would both fight for democratic socialism in Russia to get rid of the idiot autocrat, but also that would fight for their freedom and their liberation as Jews, not just for their safety, but for their rights to live beautiful, rich lives in their own language with their own culture in the Eastern European lands where they had lived for 1,000 years.
They're inspired by Marxist teaching. They're Marxists, self-proclaimed, but it's also, I think, worth taking a second just to talk about how fertile and strange that world is at that time, because I think what ends up happening, particularly after the Russian Revolution and particularly after Stalin, is that what it means to be a Marxist is very collapsed and consolidated and becomes a kind of top-down experience for many people around the world. At this point, it's still all. I mean, it's first of all, it's a very small group of people, but it's still all contested, right? I mean, like what it means to be socialist, what it means to be Marxist is being fought out in real time through a million different factions that have a whole bunch of different views on what actually that would mean in the world.
I mean, this group is founded not that many decades after Marx himself dies. And there are so many different Russian socialist groups. There
Right.
are the Narodniks, who are like socialist peasant populists. There are the SRs, the social revolutionaries that come out of the Narodniks. Within a few years of the Bund's founding, there will be the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. There are anarchists. There are groups that combine socialism with national independence movements like the Polish Socialist Party. There is a lot of revolutionary thought at this time. And all of these people know each other. They're all talking. They're all dating each other. They're all fighting with each other. And
Denouncing each other.
Writing
a lot
angry,
of denunciation.
So many angry pamphlets. Like we think we're dysfunctional because of Twitter.
No,
This is part of our heritage as leftists. And these people are really defining what it means to be a socialist at a time when socialism is still really new.
There's a kind of two frames, right, that the Jewish Bund develops in this early organizing, which is Jewish, distinctly Jewish, like they are a creature of Jewish communal life and Yiddish particularly, which is the kind of mother tongue for the folks that are living there, and are also universalist. And they have both impulses kind of next to each other in this really interesting way. Talk about what that vision of a really hated minority that is basically like you wake up in the morning and maybe today is the day that one of your neighbors comes and just like socks you in the jaw or tries to take your house, right? Like that is the reality of Jewishness at this time and their vision of like human solidarity and the bonds of brother and sisterhood with the people who, again, on any given Tuesday or Thursday might be the ones that come and try to beat you up.
They had a vision that is actually so obvious and natural that it seems crazy that it was so contested, which is, imagine you live in a place where there's multi-ethnic communities, multiracial, there's people who speak different languages. They're really different. They worship different religions. But imagine all these people can live together and make a democratic socialist government without anyone forgetting who they were. It sounds kind of like New York City, actually.
Mhm.
It's really should not be a crazy idea. But the problem was, it's that they lived at a time where every single force was making this impossible. And their vision, what they were trying to do is they were trying to deal with the fact that they are a persecuted minority in an incredibly diverse, multi-ethnic empire. And instead of trying to seek liberation by having a lot of independence movements that fight extremely bloody wars that then produce new national minorities, which will need new independence movements, and so on, they're like, what if we can all stay in our homes and we can all practice our own cultures and speak our own languages and also work for the better world together?
This concept of here-ness, which is the sort of central concept of the Bund, which is here, like here where we live as our country, like here we can all be ourselves here if we can achieve this kind of vision of socialist flourishing.
Exactly. I mean, if you are an oppressed minority, especially a very small minority, because Jews are like 3% of the Russian Empire, you have to you have to have a theory about what to do with the majority. And the Bund essentially thought that Europeans were not genetically anti-Semitic. They didn't think that anyone was like a genetic racist who God made them racist at creation. They thought that racism and anti-Semitism and national hatred were things that were pushed by the elites to keep workers divided from each other. And they really believed that with education, with contact, with friendship, with solidarity, that this sort of racism could be overcome. They did not think people were born like this.
There's a rival vision at this time. In fact, in the same year, I believe, Theodor Herzl sort of gives his first presentation with his idea for Jewish flourishing, survival, thriving, which is completely different in every way from the Bund, which is Zionism, right? And the idea that Jews can escape again, I think they basically agree on the depredations they're facing.
Yes.
It didn't take a lot of study to understand
No,
that.
I think you would realize,
Yes.
oh my God, Europeans, especially the Tsarist Empire, are hella racist. I think
Yes.
that everyone knows this.
And so his idea is we need our own country and we need to go build that country. And that's the only way that we'll be able to flourish, that we'll have safety. And from like the first moment, as you lay out in the book, the Bund and Zionists are basically mortal enemies. Like, recognize immediately in each other a kind of sort of intractable, foundational ideological conflict.
Exactly. Theodor Herzl comes from a very different milieu than what the Bund comes from. He's a subject of the Habsburg Empire, which is actually a great place to be Jewish in Europe at that time by those standards. He's a well-off guy, handsome, a journalist, and he loves living in Vienna. In fact, he even jokes at one point that like maybe Jews should just convert to Christianity, just like fit in, man, because this is great. I love Vienna. And then as a journalist, he covers the Dreyfus trial. And the Dreyfus trial is when a French, totally assimilated Jewish military officer named Alfred Dreyfus is charged with the world's most fake charges. He is ritually humiliated. He's sent to Devil's Island, and then like French mobs go haywire on Jewish neighborhoods. And when Herzl sees this, he's like, man, France is supposed to be the home of liberté, égalité, fraternité. Like, this is the sophisticated, enlightened place, right? And Dreyfus, he did everything right. He assimilated. He's not speaking Yiddish. He's an army officer, for God's sake. And yet, the racism was such that at the end of the day, Dreyfus was just a Jew. And when Herzl sees this, he becomes convinced that Europe is just racist and that as long as Jews do not have a state of their own to make them a quote unquote normal people, the way, let's say, a French person or a German person would be, that they will be a hated and persecuted and reviled minority. And he will spend the next years of his life meeting with all sorts of autocrats and oppressive figures to try to set up deals to colonize land somewhere to make a Jewish state. And at first, he's like, fine with Uganda, but he decides on Palestine. And I think it's important to note that he did not care what happened to the Palestinian Arabs, who are the majority of the population. And in fact, in his diary, he's writing about like spiriting the penniless inhabitants across the border. His vision, it's based on this profound pessimism about Europe and about just the possibilities of solidarity between people.
This conflict between the Zionists and the Bund that you really very colorfully kind of characterize and demonstrate throughout the book is that it's so intense. It starts in the beginning, even at a non-ideological, I mean, at an ideological level, but there's genuine hatred. There's like,
Yes.
they truly hate each other and kind of like, they just see each other. I mean, again, it's always funny to go back to this milieu because it does seem, in some ways, it's so relatable. Certain parts of it, people are fighting with each other and, getting into, factionalism and all this stuff, but also like the life world of these kind of frothing pre-revolutionary Europe is very different than our own.
Yes.
Where like people are just spending a lot of time on this, and the Bund has they've got classes going, and they've got trade unionists, they've got all these different things they've put together institutionally, and the Zionists are doing the same. Right. So there's like these different life worlds for Jews being built up. Talk a little bit about that kind of rivalry.
As you said, they hated each other from the start. Chaim Weizmann has a quote in like 1902. He says, Chaim Weizmann, will be the first president of Israel. And he has a quote where he says, everywhere our hardest battle is fought against the Jewish Labor Bund. And the same year, the Jewish Labor Bund says that Zionism is, quote, the most evil enemy of the organized Jewish proletariat. And the Bund bans all Zionists from membership in 1901. The Bund's life world is one of working class organizing, of trade unions, of illegal libraries, of raising the red flag in the woods, of setting up strikes, also of a fundamental rebellion against the very strict and in some ways narrow world of Orthodox Judaism, because in the Bund's milieu, you can date girls.
Right.
You can be friends
Right.
with girls. You can eat ham. You
Right,
can violate Shabbos. You can be friends with Christians. Like it's
right.
almost like a youth rebellion at the
Yeah.
same time. Meanwhile, the world of the Zionists, it tended to be a lot more like middle to upper middle class. And it tended to be a lot more accommodationist with power, because the entire idea was that first you would make a deal with the Ottoman Sultan to get these lands in Palestine, and after the Balfour Declaration that you'd make a deal with the British. And the Zionist movement, of course, was just as fragmented as the socialist movement was. You have socialist Zionists, and you have fascist Zionists, and you have richy rich Zionists, and
Right.
you have like 5 different types of socialist Zionists who all hate
Right.
each other.
Yes.
It's a frothing life world. I mean, and it's also happening, right, in these Eastern European cities that are Jewish in a way that there are no cities in the Western world that are like that, like Bialystok, which is 60% Jewish. These are Jewish worlds with all of the dispute and richness and multiplicity that involves. And to give you an idea of just the sort of picayune hatreds between the Bundists and Zionists, one of the groups that I found in my research was there was a group called the Little Bund, and these were basically the 9-year-old brothers and sisters of Bundists that wanted to make their own little group where they would like march around with red flags. They'd hold like sticks pretending they were guns, and they would try to do like a strike from school. And the Bund did not allow this, but the kids kept wanting to do this. And one of the things that the Little Bund would do is they would bully the rich little Zionist kids.
Right. So this is like they knew even at that age, they're not like immersed in the theory, but they understand like who the rival is, who the foe is.
Exactly, exactly. They understand the kids from the rival youth movement who are like a little bit richer than them, and they are they're sticking their tongues out at each other at the age of 8.
One of the things also that is captured here is that like it's so crazy because again, we pass through history and then we see it in retrospect that at the time, even if it sounds like preposterous and improbable to build a socialist egalitarian paradise in the, crucible of the Western Russian Empire, right? A state of Jews in Palestine is absolutely as totally insane and improbable, right? Like both of these are incredibly utopian visions at the time. It turns out one of them came true and not the other one, but at the time, in fact, the Bundists sort of view themselves as more clear-eyed about what's going on than the Zionists.
Oh my god, they think the Zionists are taking the good drugs. They're like, "Guys, your plan is that millions of Jews are gonna leave their homes of 1,000 years to become collective farmers in the Levant. That's your wow, what a plan." They literally thought that it was a scam by Jewish bosses so that these Jewish bosses could endow a yeshiva in Palestine and look good and then not have to pay their Jewish workers living wages. It was hallucinatory and delusional to them at first. But then things changed with the Balfour Declaration, which gives British imperial power to the Zionist project.
And there's also an ideological critique from the beginning. I mean, I think part of the, why this book has sort of exploded in the way it has and found this audience is to go back and read Jewish, leftist, humanist critiques of Zionism from, all those years ago that reads with a kind of uncanny prophecy about the kind of ethical entanglements necessitated by the logical entailment of having a state, right? Like what it means to be a nation with an army and what it means to be a nation and an army in a land that you have essentially occupied or taken, right?
And ethnically cleansed.
And that it's not going to it's going to be a lot of conflict and a lot of repression, and also that nationalism itself is a kind of poison.
The Bund had two main ethical axes that they just excoriated Zionists on. The first one was that at the time that the Bund is active, there's this idea in Europe that Jews are these like swarthy Oriental foreigners that are poisoning the body politic and that they ought to scram to somewhere else, preferably Palestine, but maybe colonize Madagascar. They don't care.
Right.
They want the racists of Europe want Jews out, and they view Jews as essentially foreign to Europe. And so when the Zionist movement says that Jews are essentially foreign to Europe and that they should get out, the Bund sees people who are submitting to their own tormentors. There's a line from 1903 that a Bund local committee says, where they say, "We are not strangers here and not guests, even though the Russian government considers us as such. This land is soaked through with our blood, and we will stay and fight for that which belongs to us, for our human, civil, and political rights." And for people who believed that, Zionism meant that you were giving in, you were letting your tormentors win. But there's another very important ethical critique, and that's once Zionism made its deal with the British Empire, with the Balfour Declaration, the Bund viewed Zionists as the handmaidens of British imperialism. They believed that Zionists were collaborating with the British occupying force to deny Palestinians their basic political rights and to strip them of their homes. And the Bund were humanists. They were socialists who believed in the dignity and equality of all humans. And they were disgusted by this.
They also, within a matter of a few years of their founding, will start to find themselves in ideological conflict, not just with Zionists, which is one of the movements, but also with other socialist movements, particularly Bolsheviks. So they are there at the present. I mean, they're basically the Bund is part of the founding of the parties that would become the Soviet Union, that would become the Russian Revolution. In some ways, the Bund is the actual mass organization. They actually have the people. They have like actual membership organizations Tell us a little bit about where they fit into the Russian Revolution, and also about their own ideological fights with, again, the ideological faction that would emerge victorious in a fairly bloody fashion.
The Bund helped found the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, the RSDLP. They were like 3 out of the 9 of the delegates. They like took care of finding the safe house. They smuggled the people in. The RSDLP is the party that, through a variety of bloody twists and turns, will become the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And the Bund was the largest component organization. The Bund had 30,000 members, even though they were just a Jewish group, at a time when the RSDLP, which is supposed to represent everyone in the Russian Empire, had 5,000 members.
Yeah, I mean, when you write about this at the time in the book, it's like you just can forget like how, in some ways, like detached from mass politics the actual left is. I mean, it's so wild because there ends up being an actual revolution and an actual, ostensibly communist state that is built. But 12 years before it all happens, or a few years between the 1905, the first one, the revolution, like it's as preposterous as a bunch of like Ridgewood hipsters, like carrying on some sort of American working class revolution in West Virginia or something.
It literally is that. So there are these communities of exiled Russian revolutionaries, including Bundists, but also including Vladimir Lenin, Trotsky, Plekhanov, Rosa Luxemburg, all these people that are living in these Western European, usually like Swiss, cities, and who are spending all of their time fighting and disputing and having congresses and denouncing each other. I call this world exile land, and it is really giving Ridgewood hipster. Like whenever I read this, I feel this shock of familiarity. I'm like, there's the dictator of the book club. There's
Right,
the
yes.
comment, not a question, man.
Yes.
These are types, and
You refer to them as what is it? The most disagreeable men you've ever met.
yes, the most disagreeable men, and they're fighting in this. They're fighting over pecun theoretical nonsense. They are splitting into ever smaller factions. They're doing every pathology and dysfunction of the left. And in this world, the king of the RSDLP, the most rapidly rising star, is a prematurely balding, extremely stubborn young man from an aristocratic background named Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, Lenin. And Lenin is someone who, in his youth, he's read Bundist texts. He even cites On Agitation, a classic Bundist book, as the de rigueur manual for organizers. But by 1903, when he is living in Western Europe, he has a very different vision of the way a socialist party should work. The Bund imagine, yes,
His way.
yes, his way. He calls it democratic centralism, which is supposed
Yes.
to be that the party, votes on things, but then ruthlessly carries out the dictates. But actually, what it means is that everyone listens to Lenin.
Right. Yeah.
And Lenin, through utilizing one of his biggest skills, which is backroom skullduggery and parliamentary shenanigans, is able to kind of successfully bully the Bund out of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party that they helped found. And the fact that he's able to bully the Bund out will set the stage for a split in the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party between followers of a guy named Julius Martov, who believe that the party should be a mass party,
Yep.
and followers of Lenin, who believe that the party should be a bunch of cult-like acolytes who follow Vladimir Lenin.
Right.
And because Lenin's able to bully the Bund out, they can't vote for Martov's faction. And so Martov's faction is stuck with the term minoriyites or Mensheviks in Russian, and Lenin gets the much cooler title of majoritiyites or Bolsheviks. And I think that this should set the stage for the dynamics that are going to play out when the real Russian Revolution, the 1917 big Russian Revolution, breaks out. And when the working women of Petrograd take to the streets, and when the Petrograd working class successfully kicks out the Tsar.
which is that Lenin comes back, famously from exile and sort of ruthlessly seizes this moment that the 12 days that shook the world, and this history is well known and very well told in your book, I got to say, of kind of seizing the moment of uncertainty, of power vacuum, right? And there's a sense in which the Bund at that moment, I mean, talk about a path not taken. A has a huge ideological mistake they make, which is that they're married to the war.
Yes.
But also that I mean, again, a recurring theme here is that, like, they're kind of, like, a little too humane and pluralistic
Yes,
w
100%.
when it comes down to, like, who's gonna shoot who's gonna cut what deal with what power faction in the bloodlands of basically 20th century Europe, which is, you're writing about what I think is probably the bloodiest period. I mean, the most murder-strewn period of human history that we have in a single place is basically the 43 years from the Bund's founding or 50 years from the Bund's founding to the end of World War II.
Absolutely. So the Bund, in the sort of the months of Russia's democratic experiment, the time between when the Tsar gets booted out and when the Bolsheviks take over, the Bund spends most of that time, I'm very sad to say, in dithering and in somehow convincing themselves through idiotic interpretations of Marxist theory that they really have to back the that they have to back Russia's continuing participation in World War I, despite the fact that literally everyone can see that Russia is losing millions of people and that the soldiers are lynching their officers. And because the Bund, but not just the Bund, because every other socialist group in Russia decides to marry themselves to continuing World War I, that provides this moment that Lenin can seize, because Lenin is the only person who says, we can't keep fighting a war if soldiers are lynching their officers and running away en masse. And when I'm reading these socialist groups clinging on to participation in World War I because of like misinterpreted Marxist theory or because of this belief that it's a responsible thing to do, I just think of how many other times in history, like good, moral people talk themselves into doing profoundly immoral and murderous things because that just seems like the serious adult reasonable thing to do.
Hmm.
And you can't but read the Boons, the months of 1917 without just feeling this sinking feeling of familiarity.
They, of course, once the Bolsheviks consolidate power, they basically purge any possible rival faction. They quickly consolidate total power. They ban other parties, and the Bund basically that again. This is the lands in which they had kind of been born. Become once again, right? I mean, under the czarist regime, and this is a thing that you write about in the book, and I can't be stressed enough. Like we think about like autocracies or like monarchies, like the czarist regime is totalitarian basically from the jump in a way that would makes other European monarchies blush. Like they like the spy system, the going to Siberia for book clubs, like they're just on another level. And so that's the world the Bund is built in, and then they get the Bolsheviks who eventually essentially recapitulate all of that very quickly and are once again either forced underground or into exile. And then there's this period before the sort of rise of fascism we should just talk about a little bit, where they do have a kind of golden age in Poland particularly. Talk a little bit about that period.
The Bund is crushed inside Soviet Russia within a few years of within a few years of the Bolsheviks seizing power. The Bund is gone. Um, Tons of Bundists are killed. Other Bundists become Bolsheviks essentially as a survival mechanism during the horrifically bloody years of the Russian Civil War. But a bunch of Bundist leaders, they cross over the border into Poland, which is now an independent state. And in Poland, they will create this alternate world. It is I mean, when I think about what the Bund was in interwar Poland, I can only think of the Black Panther Party, right? Which is
Mm.
also this group of, young Marxists from a racialized minority that is creating these huge networks of mutual aid, of clinics, of, you know, breakfast programs that is educating a generation in their own subaltern culture, despite how much the dominant society demeans that, and that is defending it with the force of arms. So I want to just like give a little, I want to give just a little look at the Bund's world. They will create an entire Yiddish secular school system. They will create summer camps, a youth movement, a women's movement that is fighting for birth control. They will unionize tens of thousands of Jewish workers and then centralize all of those unions into like the Central Bureau of Jewish Trades. They will have publishing houses. They have newspapers in various languages, newspapers that are introducing like poor Yiddish speaking workers to socialism in China and avant-garde literature from
Hmm.
France. They will also have an electoral program. They will elect Bundist leaders to like city councils around Poland. And they will back all of this up with a militia that's called the Warsaw Self-Defense Militia that is fighting with brass knuckles and with guns both the racist thugs that are trying to kick Jews out of Poland, but also the Soviet-backed communist groups that are trying to crush socialist alternatives.
There's also a contingent that comes to the US where, many of them are there at the sort of birth of, the kind of modern version of the American trade union movement, the International Ladies Garment Worker Union, which is, one of the most legendary, trade union groups in the US. And again, like more than just a union, there are still buildings that exist in the US that they help build and, they create, youth organizations and all this stuff. It was interesting that the Poland interwar years that, that's a state at the time that's sort of functioning as a decrepit, dysfunctional, often racist, but like essentially the closest the Bund gets to operating in liberal democracy
Yes,
is
it is.
is in Poland and in New York and in the US, right? Like these are the two places. And it made me think about this sort of deeper question, this deeper beef they have with the Zionists, right? Which is like, today 90% of the world Jewry lives in two states, in Israel or the US. And, there's another 10% sort of scattered around the world, right? And they're living under two very different models. And in some ways you could say, well, the Zionist model won and the Bundist model lost. But in another way, you could say that like at some level, pluralist democracy, is core to kind of the vision they had, right? Of being cheek by jowl and with other people and organizing in those spaces. And there's some way in which there's a connection between that form of government and what the Bund was sort of aching for.
Absolutely. I mean, they were social democrats. They
Right.
wanted what they called the better and more beautiful world, which was a multi-ethnic, multiracial democracy that was built on economic justice where people could have decent lives as working people. And I mean, that's why you have these like Bundist leaders who, when they escaped to America, they led these major unions. I mean, also in terms of New York history, Baruch Charny Vladik, a major Bundist leader who had a Cossack saber scar like, across his face, he became essentially the father of public housing
Yes.
in New York under the LaGuardia administration. And there are still like projects named after him, nice projects,
Yes.
the Vladik houses in the Lower East Side. And I mean, the truth is, it's how many years has it been since Israel was founded? Over 80. And over half of the world's Jews don't live there. And that's their choice that they don't live there. It's not because anything is preventing them from it. And that's because, you know, life is actually quite good in America. I mean, I live in New York City and I love it. Nothing could take me away from this amazing place. And I think that many of the Bundists, even though the Bund wasn't necessarily the right organization in and of itself for America, that the ideals that they had, that they brought here, so shaped the American vision of democratic socialism. I mean, like when I see Bernie Sanders, when I see Zohran Mamdani's campaign, I see the flickers of that past.
The sort of final ideological showdown that the Bund has, of course, is with Nazism and fascism, and it's a very moving part of the book. The maybe we talk a little bit about the Warsaw Ghetto and what happens in the Warsaw Ghetto and the Bund there and the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, and then I want to talk a little bit about this sort of the kind of question at the heart, right? The what is the lesson of this, which of course haunts all of this, and you've talked a lot about and you write about in the book, and is the kind of the debate, right? I think across sort of the Jewish diaspora, particularly, but I think across the world right now about what Israel is, what nationalism is. So talk a little bit about what once when Hitler, invades Poland, what happens to the Jews of Poland and particularly the Bund and the role they play inside what will become the Warsaw Ghetto.
In the summer of 1939, there are municipal elections in Poland, and the Bund sweeps them. They win the majority of Jewish votes in every single city where there is a big Jewish population. They are the most popular Jewish party in Poland as of the summer of 1939.
And Poland has the largest Jewish population in the world at this point.
Yes, it does. And Warsaw is the second largest Jewish city in the world after New York City. You're talking about like a population of 3.3 million people. It's about like 13% of Poland is Jewish. And then in September 1st that year, the Nazis invade. And there's this myth that a lot of Jewish people believe that their ancestors didn't fight back. And this is a slander. When the Nazis invade Poland, the puffed up military semi-dictators that run the country, they run away within a day. But
Who
the
are
Polish
also like insanely virulent violent anti-Semite
so
thugs.
so crazy.
Yeah, yeah.
They have imposed racial segregation in
Right.
Polish universities. They have
Yeah.
spent years trotting around the world trying to like make deals to deport all of their Jewish citizens to
Yes.
Madagascar. These are the people. They run away within a day. They run away to Romania with the nation's gold reserves. But the Polish Socialist Party, which is the Bund sisters' party, they decide that Warsaw cannot fall without a fight. And so they organize alongside the Bund, they organize the working people of Warsaw to fight against the Nazi invasion with Molotov cocktails, with shovels. And they are able to hold off the Nazis for 6 weeks during the siege of Warsaw. And the Bund is there on the barricades. The Bund is hand printing the only Yiddish newspaper that's still running, one of the only two newspapers, full stop, that's running. And they're fighting. They're fighting against the Nazi invasion, like with their hands. When the Nazis invade and when they propose the idea of the ghetto, the Bundeskanzlerman Arthur Ziegelboim makes a public speech urging Jews not to go into the ghetto, to resist with their bare hands if necessary. And I'm sure we all know the courage that it would take to have someone make a speech like that under the Nazis. But the Nazis do force the Jews of Poland into ghettos. And I want to describe a little bit about what the Warsaw Ghetto is, because I think a lot of people don't quite understand it. What it is 30% of Warsaw, hundreds of thousands of Jewish people. More Jewish people are in Warsaw than in Palestine right now. These hundreds of thousands of Jewish people are forced into an area that's smaller than Central Park, and they are locked in. And for years, they are starved, they are terrorized, they're tormented, and they're killed. And in the ghetto, the Bund continues as an underground that's devoted to physical survival of people, to soup kitchens, to schools, because Jewish kids are banned education. They illicitly distribute newspapers around the country, often with the help of their comrades in the Polish Socialist Party. And they desperately want guns. But the Polish Home Army, which is a heroic organization, it's the largest resistance force that will ever exist in occupied Europe, they are not particularly concerned with Poland's Jews. And also they have a plan. their plan is that they will, they'll do sabotage, they'll murder a Nazi when they can, but that they will accumulate guns and men until such and such a time that either the Western allies or the Russians are close enough to Poland, and then they will do a nationwide uprising. And this will be the most effective way to liberate Poland from Nazis, who I just want to remind everyone are brutally murdering Poles. Nazis are oppressing Polish Christians more than any other Christian group in all of Europe. I just want to make that very
Right. Yeah.
clear. And this strategy means that the Home Army doesn't necessarily want to give Jews but guns. They don't want to risk themselves to do anything to, for instance, stop these deportations that start in 1942, these deportations to Treblinka death camp that will eventually consume 90% of the ghetto's inhabitants. They don't, at their very core, think it's their responsibility. And so the Bund does not get weapons from the Polish resistance at first. Now, I want to talk about another group in the ghetto, which was a Zionist youth movement called Dror. And in the Warsaw Ghetto, that was led by a couple, these two lovers, Selina Lubetkin and Antek Zuckerman. And this couple realized earlier than I think most people did that what the Nazis were doing was not just massacres. It was not just the horrific bloodshed to which people in this region were accustomed. It was something else. It was a genocide. It wasn't something that anyone was going to survive. And these young people decide that what they need is they want a Jewish combat organization, a united Jewish group. And in order to do that, they will need to work with the Bund, but the Bund rejects them. And the Bund rejects them because they are Zionists, and also because the Bund wants to unite with the Polish resistance and to take part in the liberation of Warsaw and the liberation of their country as a whole. Now, in the summer and fall of 1942, 90% of the Warsaw Ghetto's inhabitants are murdered, including most of the Bund's adult leadership, their middle-aged leadership. The surviving middle-aged leaders are mostly in hiding at this point in what's called the Aryan side of Warsaw. And the young people of the Bund's youth movement decide that they do not care about ideological distinctions between groups anymore. They don't care if someone's a communist. They don't care if someone's a Zionist. It doesn't matter to them. What matters is being able to get guns and make a last stand in the ghetto. And I also think that there's a misconception about the ghetto uprising. People imagine it's like some sort of partisan act of resistance. They imagine it's was a military thing. The ghetto uprising was an act of mass suicide by people who knew that they were going to die anyway, who knew that they had no hope whatsoever of a military success, but who wanted to die with guns in their hands and not in a gas chamber. That's what the uprising was. The Jewish Combat Organization, which is made of very young left Zionists, Bundists, and communists, and by young, I mean their youngest fighters are 13 years old, will get 50 guns from the Home Armies, from the Polish Home Army, one machine gun, and then we'll have Molotov cocktails and light bulbs filled with battery acid. And with that, these young people will launch the first urban uprising against the Nazis in Nazi-occupied Europe, the very first one. And they will hold off the Nazi war machine for almost a month.
The ghetto uprising is such a moving story. It's so profound and sad and tragic, but also sort of hopeful. And, it sort of brings us to this ideological question, right? Because in the end, almost everyone who is in the uprising is killed. Not all of them. Marek Edelman, quite famously not, who would go on to be a cardiologist and Polish politician and live in Poland and become part of the Solidarity movement. This is one of those cases where You know, like the bell curve meme with like the dumb person and then like the person with like 100 IQ and then like the super smart person and like the dumb
Yeah.
person and the smart person have the same view. Like this idea that like, one example of this would be like the cause of the Civil War was slavery, which is one of those things where it's like that's the first thing you learn, and then you learn like, well, it's complicated and tariffs and all this stuff. And then it's like, well, no, it's slavery.
Yeah.
And like there is a little temptation I have, even after reading this book and loving this book, that like, yeah, the version you read is that like this debate within Jewish life about our path forward for survival, collective flourishing, that the Holocaust sort of settles it. And not because it kills people, because you've said this before, and I think it's true, like murder doesn't settle a debate. Like that's not the way you win an argument. But in this question of where can we be safe? What kind of life can we have where we collectively flourish? That the Herzl's the sort of sickening feeling he has watching Dreyfus, right? Which is like there were always going to be one demagogue, one mob, one moment of this sort of suppressed anti-Semitism away from not being part of this place. That like that is kind of the story. I mean, in particularly with Nazism, particularly the fact that there are, some of the most assimilated, successful, wealthy, cultured Jews in the entire world in Berlin at this point, right? Like in the same way Dreyfus is like a freaking military officer, right? And that basically this idea that like there's something fundamental here, they will never have us. What do you say to that?
I mean, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the historical part first. So sometimes there's this idea that, I mean, this is something that people write to me all the time. They're like, the Zionists lived, the Bundes died. I get this. I get this
Right.
message hundreds of times a day. And first of all, it's not true. I mean,
That's not
hundreds of
true.
thousands of Zionists were murdered, in the Holocaust. But
There's
also,
millions of Jews who are killed of every single ideological stripe.
yes, exactly.
Yeah, right.
Exactly. They're murdered because they were Jews, not
Right,
because of
right.
any belief. But I think that there's this other idea, which is that like Palestine was somehow intrinsically safe for Jews. And that's not true. The reason that the Jewish community was safe in Palestine was because Palestine was occupied by the British Army. And the British Army, not the Jewish community of Palestine, but the British Army was able to stop Rommel at Al Alamein in Egypt, Rommel being the famous Nazi general.
Right.
And if Rommel had not been stopped by the British, the Jews of Palestine would have been murdered. Right. And if for some reason it would have been impossible to have an independent Israel before the Holocaust, but let's say magically there was, why do people think that that independent Israel wouldn't have been slaughtered just like all of the small independent states in Europe were by the Nazis? What delusion makes people think that that a small state could have held off Nazi Germany, a war machine so powerful that it pushed the Red Army back to Moscow? It's the reason that the Yishuv survived was because of contingency. It was not because of anything beyond that. It's the same reason that Jews survived in Buenos Aires or in New York City, right, or in Melbourne or Johannesburg. It's because they were far away enough. And because military powers stronger than any that the Jews could marshal were able to stop the Nazis. That's why. So I don't believe in deriving one's sense of ethics or political possibility from essentially historical accident. But
there is a deeper question there, right?
There is a deeper question, which is whether Europe is too racist. That's the question. Not the world, but Europe, right?
Right. Yes, I guess that's Herzl's fundamental view, but I think the more universalist version today is that that the world is too anti-Semitic, basically, right? It's more than that, right? Because the sort of permutation of, I think, modern Zionism, right, is that was true of Europe, but it's true of the modern world. It's certainly true of the Muslim world. It will always be true of the Christian world, that we are, we're forever a tiny part of the world's population. That's never going to change, right? That will always be the case. We're going to be a small part of it. And we're always going to be suspicious to them and hated by them. And so the only way to get protection is to accrete into a state with our own weapons, army, nuclear bomb in the case of Israel, right? And also, and I think this is the key part of this, is like to not be a minority, right? That's the other. There's the guns part, there's the state part, but there is also this kind of demographic part, right? Which is always inextricably bound up with the logic of this and the argument today, which is to not be a minority.
I mean, I think here I just want to talk about like what that meant, right? What did it mean for Jews not to be a minority? It meant that they had to ethnically cleanse 750,000
Yes.
Palestinians and have the remaining survivors under military rule just being tortured for generations. And then it meant that they put tons more Palestinians under a brutal military occupation that has culminated in a genocide that has now spilled over the entire region and has led to the ethnic cleansing of like huge new swaths of the West Bank, of South Lebanon, and of this idiotic war with Iran that has murdered thousands and thousands of Iranian civilians and seems ready to plunge the world into a famine. So that's what it cost for Jews to have a state where they actually are still technically a minority in it, if you look at everyone in between the river and the sea. And I'm sorry, like there's nothing in the world that will make me okay with ethnic cleansing, that will make me okay with apartheid, and that will make me okay with genocide. And I fundamentally believe that there has to be something more to history than the idea that we all take turns ethnically cleansing each other and murdering each other until, I don't know, we're all
Until
dead.
what? Right. Yes,
Yeah,
exactly. Until what
the-
is the final state? Yes.
what is the final state? I mean, I don't know. Maybe they should have made a Jewish state in Germany. Maybe that should have been the answer. I kid.
Right.
But there's nothing in the world that will justify to me the crimes of ethnic cleansing and apartheid and genocide. And those were essential. Those were essential to the Zionist project.
And one of the things I think that keeps coming through is that, again, no one in the world knows ethnic cleansing better than the people in the bloodlands of Europe. Right. I mean,
Right.
the Bund keeps saying this, right? And it's become this kind of, I mean, what's so revelatory here is that it's become almost this trope in modern discourse about the Zionists, that they're sort of like repeating the fascists' crimes, right? And,
Yes.
And I think sometimes, in a way, frankly, from folks, it feels a little on the edge to me of like some kind of gross anti-Semitism, like a sort of transgressive glee in like calling Jews Nazis, basically. The Bund, there's a line in there. I mean, this fight, I mean, it's so crazy. It's happening in the IDP camps in 47.
Yes,
They've just all gone through the Shoah. There's a tiny percentage who've lived. They're in the worst. They've managed to live, but they're in the worst possible straits anywhere. They're in internally displaced persons camps. They're coming back to homes where people hate them.
Where people are murdering them. The Polish nationalists murdered 1,000 Jews after the Holocaust.
Their kids have been sometimes taken in by families that they're trying to basically get back. And here they are, and the Zionists and the Bund are at each other's throats.
They're still fucking fighting each other.
In the IDP. And the Zionists decide we need an army, and they basically try to do conscription. They try to do a draft.
They do a draft. So after World War II ends, the like leadership of the Jewish Agency, like Ben Gurion, you know, the Zionist leadership, let's say, they realize that there's going to be a war for Palestine now, that World War II postponed that, but there's going to be a war. The borders of the new state are going to be decided through force. And they, in some ways, are in a good position. They have like really good intel that they've gotten on Palestinians. And also they have weapons. A lot of people don't know this, but the first military backer of the Nakba was not the U.S. or the British. It was the Soviet Union that gave the Haganah weapons through Czechoslovakia. But they have weapons, but they're also a minority, right? The population of Palestine now is like 1/3 Jewish and 2/3 Palestinian Arab, and they need bodies. And so Ben Gurion starts looking at the population of these displaced persons camps for what he calls human material. It's a very charming phrase he uses. And the Haganah will impose a draft. Now, you ask, how does the Haganah impose a draft when Israel does not exist as a state yet? And also these people are not even in Palestine. They're in Europe, and they're not citizens of an Israel that doesn't exist. And what it is it's that the Zionist movement was able to take control of the camp administrations of the Jewish displaced persons camps, which gave you like your rations, your housing, your job. And they use this position to coerce people to sign up for the Haganah. And at the end, they even use physical violence. Like there are reports from Bundists in the Bundist press of people being publicly beaten, of even people's family members being beaten to try to coerce them to join the Haganah and to essentially become soldiers doing the Nakba.
There's a line about oh God, I'm trying to find it here, but the butcher, like during the butchery, the germ has moved to the
Yes,
butchered.
yes. This is
Uh,
Shlomo Mendelssohn. I'll try to paraphrase it from memory, but he says that it's ironic that Jews, who were the primary victims of totalitarianism, should have adopted their methods. It's as if the slaughterer infected the victim with his germs during the slaughter.
the slaughter infected it, and then there's this very beautiful thing written by Bundist Livik Hoods. And again, I find the stuff from 47 and 48 so powerful because I think the argument that people say of like, well, all that was before the Holocaust. So like, after the Holocaust, how can you keep having these arguments? How can you keep thinking this? Like, obviously, this has settled the question. And so to read him saying that their belief in mankind is not popular today, in these last years, we have all seen it become deeply debased, despoiled, and spat on. But if man is at heart a beast, no amount of running away will help.
I mean, they believed that human solidarity was the only thing that could save us. And they knew better than anyone in the world how fraught that was, how fragile it was, how easily it shattered. But that's also all there is, because if there isn't that, then what is there? Taking turns as slaughterer and victim forever?
Molly Crapapple is an artist, a journalist, and an author. She's the author of numerous books, and her latest, the New York Times bestseller, Here Where We Live Is Our Country, The Story of the Jewish Bund. It's just a fascinating, I mean, if you're just a history buff, you should read it. If you're interested in the politics of today, you should read it. If you're enmeshed in debates now about Zionism and anti-Zionism and Jewish life and anti-Semitism, you should read it. It's got something for everyone. It's really a great book. Molly, thank you so much.
Thank you.